My name is Mari Moreau, and I'm a member of the Cambodia Ireland Changemaker Network, a group of people in Ireland and Cambodia who work in a mutually beneficial way to enhance education. Supporting us today with all her technical skills is Hala Ali from Irish Global Health Network. Because we're coming from many different places and dependent on Wi-Fi connections, we hope everything will run smoothly, but apologies if we run into glitches along the way. Our webinar hopes to open up conversation about the importance of quality education and to bring greater understanding of Cambodia through the lens of Cambodians themselves, Irish people who are living there, and people whose worldview tries to bring us closer together. You, our audience, are coming from many places around the world, so please take time to use the chat box to enter your name and where you're viewing from. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website. If you have any question during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen, and we'll come to those questions at the end of each session. We set the scene for our discussions with a short video made by Rorth. In making this film, Rorth used footage from SeeBeyondBorders and PEPI Empowering Youth, two Cambodian NGOs that we have close links with. Straight after the video, Rorth will introduce himself and his very special guest.
I think the biggest problem in Cambodia is lack of human resource because Cambodia is a slow developing country. Some people in Cambodia, they give up to school, especially students in high school. Some people, they get married in a very young age, and some people, they migrate to work in another country.
Avoid trafficking. And more importantly, I want to avoid the corruption of my community.
Greetings from Cambodia. I am Pearl, a teacher by background, and today I am a country manager of SeeBeyondBorders. I am the first person in my district to go to secondary school. My mother was determined that her son would have a better life. She believes in the power of education. Every day, I would cycle 20 kilometers to the nearest school so that I could improve my life chances. People thought that my mother was foolish. She was not. My mother believes education was the only way forward. A highlight of my career was visiting Ireland with leaders from the Cambodian Ministry of Education. The study and collaboration was wonderful. We visited schools including one in Donabet, DCU, and met with the government.
Something that me feel so excited about my future is when I graduate a bachelor degree and I get to work in one of institutions that include with sustainable development goals to develop in my community, because my dream and my goal are to see in my community developing how good human resource, very young people graduate and has a good job.
Okay. Thank you, Mary, for the introduction. សូមអរគុណច្រើន Mary សម្រាប់ការណែនាំហើយជម្រាបសួរអ្នកទាំងអស់គ្នា Good evening from Cambodia. It is currently 6 p.m. here in Siem Reap. I am Rorth, a member of Cambodia Ireland Changemaker Network and a movie screenwriter by background. And also currently now I am working for an NGO here in Siem Reap. Today, I have an honor to talk to a global award-winning film producer as a special guest in our online webinar today, Window to Cambodia. Special guest today is Lord David Puttnam. We will have between 10 to 15 minutes, a little bit of the background from Mr. David Puttnam. He spent more than 30 years as an independent film producer. Some of his well-known films are Midnight Express, Chariots of Fire, The Mission, and very notably the film called The Killing Field, which is a film about a horrendous time of Cambodian history, a regime that killed more than 1.7 million people, targeted specifically higher-ranking people and educational ones. He's also been a politician and has a particular interest in education. Today, I am very delighted and very honored to have him joining the webinar today. Please welcome Lord David Puttnam. Hello, Mr. David. How are you today?
I'm well, Rostan. Very nice to be with you.
Thank you very much. To begin with, how should I call you? How would you like to be called? Is it like Mr. David?
My mother always called me David, so I think that will do.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm sure a lot of people joining the webinar today knows you very clearly, but just in case for those who has not known you yet, probably can you introduce yourself to the audience today?
Yes, I'll try. Ironically, it's an interesting week. I retired this week from the House of Lords. So in the last 24 years, I've been an active member of the House of Lords. I'm a Labour member of the House of Lords. Prior to that, for 30 years, I was a film producer. And prior to that, actually, I was in advertising for 10 years. So I've had a varied career. And I live in West Cork, Ireland. I've lived here for 33 years, commuted back and forth to London. I'm not sorry to end the weekly commute, especially as we haven't got an airport at the moment here in Cork. Right. And yeah, all in all, I've visited Cambodia many times. Originally, when we made the film in 1984, of course, we couldn't come into Cambodia. We went as far as Aranyapatep on the border where we filmed, but we couldn't actually come into Cambodia. But we worked with an enormous amount of Cambodians, refugees who were in Bangkok and other parts of Thailand. So there's a large Cambodian representation in the film. And of course, Hang Noor, who was the key figure and who won the Oscar for his portrayal, was central to us, our ability to deliver a good movie. Worth just saying, what is the film? The film actually is a personal relationship set against a catastrophic background. And for me, that's what cinema does best. If you just set up a situation where all you're doing is trying to depict the catastrophe of a country, that's a documentary. We didn't set out to do that. We set out to deal with a very specific relationship, which for us emblemized the relationship of the West with generally with Southeast Asia. And I'd like to think we reasonably succeeded. But since then, I've been the UK representative, cultural and trade representative to Southeast Asia. And in that job, for 5 years, I was visiting for twice a year. That finished 3 years ago. So I've visited many, many times. I love Cambodia. I'm also, last declaration of interest, I sit on the board of the company that controls the British International School in Phnom Penh. So I've also got a lever into that, which may sound odd because I've worked in public education, but we made the decision that this particular school is really educating potentially the leaders of Cambodia, certainly children of ministers, etc. And built into their education are the UN Development Goals. So these are kids who, irrespective of whether you approve, disapprove, whatever of their backgrounds they come from, are being educated at a school in which UN Development Goals are central to that education, which I think is not perfect, but it's a significant move in the right direction. We have 77 schools in 33 countries.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for your introduction. This is very great. To begin with, so as a young Cambodian who works in movie industry, film industry, and TV, something like that, I have a very particular interest in that particular field. So, and especially the movie The Killing Fields fascinates me a lot. So I'm going to dive right into that particular topic.
Okay.
If you can, I can begin the question with why The Killing Field, the movie The Killing Field from the beginning? What is your motivation? How do you hear about this story and how you started?
You know, I'm happy to do a lot of explaining at the moment as to why I was leaving the House of Lords. And I wrote a very long piece, if anyone's interested. I wrote a long lecture that came out Friday of last week called the Shirley Williams Memorial Lecture, explaining all of my background thinking, but also explaining the influences on me. And they may be slightly surprising. In 1970-71, I read a book called Inside the Third Reich by a man called Albert Speer, which was an inside view of how the Nazi regime had taken over Germany in the early 1930s and how that had all occurred. And I was very, very intrigued by this film because Speer had been much the same age that I was then when he made the decision to join the Nazi Party. And obviously that's the decision that affected the whole of his life. So I audaciously put in a bid for this book, not thinking for a moment I'd have any chance. But what the publisher offered me was the ability to go down to Heidelberg, where Speer lived. He'd only been out of prison 5 years, and meet him. So I did. And I explained why I thought the film was important for my own then generation. And to my amazement, he said, you know what, you're right. If this film is going to be made, it should be made by young people for a younger generation. So I spent hours and hours with Speer over the next 6 months, maybe more. And from him, I understood the nature of evil, I think. I understood how what's Hannah Arendt calls the banality of evil, how it creeps up on you, how people lose their moral compass, how they cease to any longer be able to make judgments between right and wrong. And in Speer's case, it was particularly potent because he had every opportunity, if he'd been more politically aware, to understand what was going on, because he was a highly intelligent man. He ended up becoming Hitler's armaments minister. And that had a profound impact on me. We never got the film made, but I took the fee and we made 2 documentaries, one called Swastika and one called Double-Headed Eagle, which tell the entire story, political story of Germany from 1918 to 1945. That experience, I think, colored everything I did. So the films, most of the films I made, I found out of odd bits of information. In the case of Chariots of Fire, it was a small chapter, not even chapter, paragraph in a record history of the Olympic Games. But in the case of the Killing Fields, it was a single column in Time magazine, which all it said was that this man, Duth had been reunited with the New York Times columnist or journalist that he'd been separated from them. And it showed a photograph of him. And I was very intrigued. And I wrote to the New York Times asking them for background, and they were very generous and sent me copies of this whole story as it had developed. It was amazing when you think back. And I got more and more intrigued, and I got on a plane and I went to visit Mr. Schamberg and Mr. Pran. And we got on well. And through an intervention of some other people, I was able to buy the rights to their story, which is giving a very shorthand version. I then worked with a writer for 2 years, working on the screenplay. It was over at least 2 years. It was 4.5 years from beginning to end. And we developed script. During that time, Chariots of Fire came out, it was a success, that gave me some leverage. I'd had a previous success with Midnight Express, and I was able to put the film together. One of the extraordinary pieces of luck was we were still looking for the person to play Duth until 1 month before we started shooting. And we'd actually had a reasonably well-known Chinese actor in the wings. And one of our casting director went to a Cambodian wedding in California, and Mr. Hang Nor made a speech at the wedding. It was his niece's wedding, and she was so impressed by his speech that she approached him. He was a doctor, So the idea, as you probably know, in Cambodia is being a doctor is a rather higher class thing than being an actor. So we had a big job persuading that would he mind acting in a film? Anyway, he did, and it was a wonderful success. He tragically was killed a decade ago, more than a decade ago. Anyway, that's the story of how the film came to be made. It was an extraordinary, it was the most physical experience of my life. We had to what we call shoot and move. Every day we had to be on a new location. I lost, I think, half a stone in weight, and but anyway, we got the movie together. The movie was successful, I think, beyond any of our wildest dreams. In truth, I'm still kind of pinching myself, and
right.
And then I got the opportunity on the BBC, once you could get into Cambodia, to come and make a documentary about the killing fields, which by this time had become a generic term, interestingly. And so I made a documentary about what had gone on, and we visited all the sites that are now very familiar to people. At that point, they weren't at all familiar to people. And one way or another, I got more and more engaged and involved in Cambodia. I would just make a couple of observations. First of all, whoever did this paper, it's really an excellent paper. I really congratulate whoever wrote this. It's an excellent briefing. I get a lot of briefings, not many of them are as good as this. One thing I feel very strongly about, and if I were to make a film now in Cambodia, is I would want to address the legal system. The reason I say that is because we're touching on education. Of all the areas of the countries I visited, where the greatest fragility exists is where the legal system is not trusted. So the creation of trusted lawyers who then become trusted judges and create trusted courts and a trusted legal system is for me, the fundamental for nation building. If you haven't got trusted courts, you can't really build a nation. I know it's rather simplistic, but I feel that. And everywhere in the world where you find the judiciary either under attack or corrupt is a failed state, or potentially a failed state. So were I to make a film today, it would be about, probably, I do believe in making films about individuals. It would be about a young man or woman, probably woman, who wanted to be a lawyer, and the challenges she experienced in building her way through, because at some point she would experience problems at present. She would experience potentially corruption. She'd experience the opposite, as it were, of preference. And it would be a big, big fight for a woman to emerge as a senior legal person, a judge even, in Cambodia under the present circumstances. And yet, until Cambodia can achieve that, it will be a half-formed nation. So if I were the Irish government wishing to place resources somewhere, it would be in the promotion of young women in the legal profession and protecting them so they could sustain their integrity as they went through climb that particular ladder.
Thank you. Thank you for your very insightful knowledge in filming, and also touch on education as well. I could have a lot of questions to ask you right now, but because of the timing that we have, 10 to 15 minutes, that definitely not enough. But before we finishing up our conversation today, do you have any last words for the Cambodian and Irish audience that are in the chat room right now before we finishing up this conversation?
Yes, I think that my experience over those 5 years where I was coming and going a lot, the Irish are remarkably trusted. Irish are a remarkably trusted nation in the third world. Why? Because of their own colonial experience, because to an extent, I have to say, because of the extraordinary performance of nuns and priests throughout the world. It is quite amazing how those memories are still held very, very dear in developing countries. So there is a commonality of experience, if you like, which I think is very important, and a trust. I would love to see Ireland build on that trust. I have one other challenge, and this is connected to climate change. I suspect that Cambodia may well be one of the countries quite significantly affected by climate crisis in the next decade. That climate crisis is likely to result in significant numbers of refugees. So if I could wish one thing, and I probably won't live to see this, if I could wish for one thing, it would be for sufficient ties to be bound between Ireland and Cambodia, so that if, as and when such crises occurred, Ireland would become a very welcoming environment and a country that particularly welcomed and understood the need to take in refugees and build a Cambodian community, which will be in probably quite difficult straits. So that, I think, is a very interesting building block. If the planning could begin and the relationships could begin, which enabled Ireland to be a natural destination for Cambodian refugees, that would be a very wonderful thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having time with us today. I am deeply appreciated for your time and insight, and also acting as a messenger for our Cambodian and Irish people here. Again, tremendous thank you very much, Mr. David. I would like to give this back to Mary. Thank you very much.
Mary, can I just apologize? My wife has just come out of hospital, so I can't stay beyond 12:30, but I'll stay with you until then and watch with interest. Sorry, Mary.
Thank you so very much, David. Look, thanks, Rorth, and also thank you to David Puttnam. You know, you have shared so many inspirational thoughts just in that short time. So, and from your own experience, from your own ideas, and it's a great start to our webinar, so thank you. We're going to move on now to our first panel, and I'd like to introduce Michael Clifford, who's a well-known journalist and author and working with the Irish Examiner. And Mick will discuss the topic Cambodia in the World Today with our three panelists. We have Kimsru Duth, Des Molloy, and Paul Gillespie. Kimsru has wide educational experience, especially with Cambodian young adults, and she successfully completed her master's in Dublin City University in International Development, Environment and Conflict. She was funded for those studies by Irish Aid. Dr. Des Molloy has worked in the area of peace, conflict resolution and demilitarization for many years in conflict zones around the world. And he has close links with Centers for Peace and Reconciliation in Hiroshima and Siem Reap. And he works as adjunct professor in the area of international relations in Panesastra University, Phnom Penh. Dr. Paul Gillespie is a very well-known journalist with the Irish Times and is also a highly regarded expert in international relations. Dr. Gillespie recently published an article of relevance to this conversation today called Europe and the Indo-Pacific Concept, looking at Europe's role, and I suppose in a way, Ireland's role in a changing Asian dynamic. You're all very welcome, and I'd like to hand over to Mick.
Mary, thank you very much, and thanks to Cambodia Ireland Changemaker Network for inviting me to moderate this panel today. Just before I start, could I mention that I have read David's lecture from last Friday, and I think it is a fantastic piece of work that should be required reading for anybody either in politics or public life or intending to go into it today. It's a very timely piece of work in terms of the world we live in today. I'd like to start with a general topic of our panel, and that is the ambition to raise Cambodia to an upper middle income country by 2030 is there, and for it to be a developed country by 2050. So I'd like to ask each of our panelists what they see as the greatest barrier to achieving those targets. And if I could start with you, Kimsru.
Hello everybody, Kimsru from Phnom Penh. Cambodia is wanting to become a developing country, middle hyper income country in 2030 and developed country by 2050. And the barriers to that from my perspective is the human capital, because Cambodia, as we mentioned earlier, that the effect of the Khmer Rouge has impacts on the human capital in Cambodia, and education quality in Cambodia isn't up to the standard, not just like an international standard, but compared to our neighboring country, we are a little bit far behind. So in order to achieve the goal that we set, that would be one of the barriers.
Thank you, Kimsru. Perhaps I could go to Des with the same question.
Yeah, certainly the area of education is suffering greatly, and we've seen that the development index is retarded by about 4 years as a result of COVID at the moment. The Cambodian people are entrepreneurial, and in the 30 years since I arrived here as a military observer, we have seen extraordinary development, and we have seen the movement and the development of a new middle class that we didn't have before. Now, the government, the CPP, are aware that they need a middle class, a middle income middle class to support their requirements in the country in the absence of major other resources. And I think that they are sufficiently smart to continue to facilitate the growth of a middle class. As I said, the people are entrepreneurial. Education is a major problem that is further retarded now by COVID, but the absence of the availability of microcredit in some areas is a major area for retarding development in the country. But government policy, while they're looking at how China has developed and how they're trying to model their system on the Chinese system, particularly the aggressive Xi Jinping model at the moment, they know, and from watching the collapse of the economy in Myanmar, that they should not tighten the string too tightly. And I believe that they will facilitate the continued development of the country. Whether we will reach middle income in accordance with the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, I can't say, but we have come so far in the past 30 years that it's quite extraordinary. So I'm hopeful.
Okay, thanks, Des. And Paul Gillespie, can I go to you with the same question?
Yeah, I don't know Cambodia directly, and my knowledge is more of the region, but I'm impressed by David Puttnam's remarks about the judicial system and the importance of institutional capacity to tackle development issues as they arise. If you're developing a middle class as part of that development effort, that judicial system and a transparent and human rights-based access to institutions are really important. And I know Cambodia has been criticized for the lack of this, and I think there's a big challenge there to develop those institutions so as to enable give the political conditions for development over the next decades.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think we've seen that in Ireland going back 70, 80 years, the importance of institutions bedding down and then being able to have trust in them. And I suppose also the importance when you're looking for investment from outside the country, that they can trust that the institutions are there to ensure that investment is properly made and any notion of corruption is kept to a minimum in that respect, whatever about others. Des, just coming back to you, the position of women in the country, and particularly today, and we have seen today, particularly in the West, the realization of how women have been treated in the past in all sectors of society, but this is a particular problem in some parts of the developing world. To your mind, in your experience, what is the position of women in Cambodia and how can it be improved, particularly through education?
Gosh, well, certainly there is a focus on gender parity throughout the world. I do think the position of women in Cambodia is probably better than I've seen in other countries, better than it was in the 8 years I've just recently spent in Myanmar. I think I'm not sure the percentage of representation in government, but certainly majority of teachers would be women. I'm not sure where the issues are in relation to women. The absence of healthcare, of maternal health care, is a problem everywhere in many areas of Southeast Asia, in the developing countries, in Myanmar, in Laos, in Cambodia. The absence of public goods, social goods, and investment in social goods is a problem. Within education, girls are the ones suffering most, particularly as a result of COVID, and the girls are the ones that are likely to remain at home working or in other tasks rather than going back even to primary education. So I still think that to address the issue of the absence of parity of women and equality of women in society here, the investment needs to be in the area of education and ensure that women can participate in the education system fully and girls can participate in education, and that they are not encouraged to remain at home on domestic tasks, particularly as we come out of COVID now.
And Kimsru, how would you feel about that?
For me, like when I was young, the role of women is a bit different from now, but it has changed a lot. Since I was young, when a very small decision, it has to go through the husband or the breadwinners of the family. But right now, like in the careers, in education, women has played like very important role. For example, in my family before, like nobody can support me or help me with my homework in grade 4 or grade 5. But right now, like younger family, younger mother can support better for their kids' education, as well as working independently. Previously, like women cannot like drive. Right now, you can see a lot of women are driving, and I feel like we need more women to hold a lot of leadership position, either in politics, in education, or become entrepreneur. And I have a lot of female friends who are like an independent businesswoman.
Well, that's certainly more encouraging than perhaps some of us who wouldn't be as across it might think, particularly in some areas of the developing world. Looking at the region, the broader aspect of the region, and the briefing paper to which David Puttnam referred, I have to say, endorsed that it was an excellent piece of work. I noticed in it that the suggestion that Cambodia, that perhaps there should be a change of the focus of Ireland's contribution to development in the Mekong sub-region from Vietnam, which it seems was the main focus, certainly up until the last year or so, to Cambodia in terms of aid and assisting development. Paul Gillespie, why do you think that should be the case, or should it?
Well, I think there's a strong case made in the briefing paper and by the people organizing this webinar for an emphasis on Cambodia. I think the aid to Vietnam has done its job. I mean, I think it was quite carefully specified, and that it goes in a rotation. It's a very good thing to look at the region from a point of view of Irish aid and development policy. The region is really significant in terms of geopolitics these days. It's managed to hold itself together since the 1960s to protect the independence of the new states in a post-colonial setting, to develop a way of working the so-called ASEAN way of consensual non-interference type of politics. And it created that space at a time when there wasn't the kind of geopolitical pressure from large powers that there now is with the developing relations between China and the US. So it's interesting that Cambodia is next year taking on the chair of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This gives opportunities and challenges because they're going to be under pressure from the Chinese, who give them lots of aid. They're going to be under pressure, countervailing pressure from the United States. They're going to have to represent the ASEAN values in a setting where these pressures apply. Recently, ASEAN has decided not to accept the military leader of Myanmar at a summit next week. Now, that's a significant move by ASEAN, and they have an opportunity, ASEAN, to try and protect those values and protect the kind of neutrality and the centrality of their role in the next decade. And if Cambodia can manage to give a constructive leadership there, I think that will be a big contribution.
Des, what do you think of that?
Mm-hmm.
Did you call me there?
Yes, sorry, Desmond.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, I think Hun Sen needs to leave a legacy, and he sees his time might not be too long, and that he has a chance to set his legacy in his presidency of ASEAN going forward. It was quite surprising that ASEAN, which is based on principles of consensus and non-interference, that it actually did not invite Min Aung Hlaing to the next meeting, much to the shock of Min Aung Hlaing. But it's obvious that China is becoming impatient with the lack of stabilization of the situation after the coup of the 1st of February. And it must have given the nod to Hun Sen not to speak too loudly, because I understand that Cambodia was one of the countries that was opposed to preventing Min Aung Hlaing from coming to the ASEAN meeting, and they abstained and they allowed there be a consensus decision to not invite him. So I think Hun Sen will be looking at his age-old win-win policy in which he pragmatically solved the problems of the Khmer Rouge war in 1997 by buying off the generals, by bringing them into the system, and by giving them basically everything they wanted. And I think he will be looking for some similar sort of solution by reinforcing his win-win approaches in Myanmar. And it could be a good opportunity for him to cement the legacy he wants to leave and give him the say in his succession also. So that's what I'd say about that. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Des. Kimsru, just to ask you, I mean, do you feel as somebody of your generation in Cambodia that Vietnam, for example, and some of the other countries have advanced faster and that there's a certain amount of catching up to do in that respect?
Yeah. Can you repeat again, please?
Sorry, Kimsru. Do you feel that Vietnam and the development of Vietnam and some other neighboring countries has advanced much quicker than that of Cambodia?
Yes, that's the feeling, and it's not just the feeling, it's the fact. And one of the reasons that we are lag behind is the education. That's why this group of people and many other are working on improving the education and really want that Irish Aid can come and provide more support to Cambodia to improve the education system.
Right, and the education system you mentioned, Kimsru, as we know, the rural nature of Cambodia, I think it's something like 80% 20 rural-urban divide. Is it much more difficult to get a shot at universal education for everybody when the country is so much rurally based?
Yeah, most of the students who are living in rural area, they don't have many opportunity to go to the third level of education or like a bachelor degree. Most of them either drop out at the age of like 16, 17 when they are in grade 10 or 11. And but compared to the past, the percentage of students going to school and finish university has increased. However, that number, in order, like I mentioned before, in order to achieve higher middle income country by 2030, that percentage and the quality that we have is not meeting that goal. But if we keep on improving the quality and provide more opportunity, not just for the student in the city, but in the rural area, through scholarships, through different kind of educational support, that would be very helpful.
Des, could I ask you in a similar vein, there is obviously a big divide between standards of living and education, urban and rural in Cambodia. Is it a major issue that gap has to be closed?
Well, I have a foot in both camps in that I have a farm in Kampong Spoo, as well as living in the city in Phnom Penh. And I prefer to live in Kampong Spoo in the rural environment with the extended family in Kampong Spoo, who have coping mechanisms that the families in the city don't have. I don't think there is a huge gap. I think educationally, yes, there is a problem, but the problem is both in the city. The standard of education that's available both rurally and in the city is lower than it should be. And that's where there needs to be investment. But I think regarding quality of life, standard of living, there isn't a huge divide. And as I said, my extended family here prefer to spend the weekends with the family in the countryside. And it's a rural farming family in a village in Kampong Spoo, and the standard of living is good.
I used to live in Siem Reap. It's a smaller city compared to Phnom Penh, and I prefer Siem Reap.
I think we all do. I prefer to be in rural Ireland than Dublin myself, but that's neither here nor there. Paul, just in that vein, in your experience in the Asian countries and parts of the developing world, is there enough political will to invest in education and to appreciate the value of some form of universal education?
Oh, I think it's very well established as an aspiration. I think the scientific research shows how important it is. The political will is to do with the allocation of resources, isn't it? And it's then a question of choices between that and other kinds of expenditure. I think it varies a lot from country to country. It depends on leadership within educational institutions and within political parties. So that the research is there to show the pathways of development that can arise from such investment. I'm very taken by the contrast the speakers have drawn between the urban and rural experience. I think to indicate progress simply by urbanization is a great mistake. We're learning that perhaps in Ireland. I think it's being learned on a massive scale in China. You look at the colossal urbanization, but the quality of life doesn't necessarily follow if you urbanize at that pace and to that extent. So I think education should take account of these wider social desiderata, if you like, that you want to have a decent balance, and we can do with technology. We can have a better balance between urban and rural as contexts in a society which comes mainly from a rural background, as Cambodia does.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you in terms of urbanization isn't the answer. And I suppose the question of ensuring that leaders appreciate that and that whatever extra investment is required to bring education to rural areas rather than expecting people to come to the urban area to be brought up to that kind of standard. Des, as somebody who experienced both, perhaps more than most people who are on the webinar, well, I'm not sure of that, but two contrasting questions you might address. What can Cambodia learn from Ireland? And equally important, what can Ireland learn from Cambodia?
I'm not sure if this answers that question, but one thing that certainly Cambodian students can learn, and I see in a note by Cecil Holmes here, the absence of critical thinking, the absence of a critical pedagogy in Cambodia, the investment from Ireland, where you have contrary students that are ready to tear down the professor and put him on the spot to a greater degree. This doesn't happen in Cambodia. I came armed 2 months ago as a university professor with Paulo Freire, ready for a critical pedagogy, and I'm breaking my neck trying to get a question out of my class each time. Don't mind critical thinking. So I think Cambodians can learn from the Irish the benefit of critical thinking. I think if you're asking me about the psyche of the Troubles versus the time of the Khmer Rouge, I think there isn't a relationship, because in Ireland, with our troubles, we had another, but in Cambodia, the genocide was an auto-genocide. And so the people of Cambodia would like to bury the memory of that, because what happened generally they did to themselves. I think the war crimes here, the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia were imposed on Cambodia largely by a diaspora in the United States and by a guilty international community, but it was not something that either the CPP, the Cambodian People's Party, or the people of Cambodia called for. And in the end, it was just a money-making effort for the CPP generally. But I don't think that we can compare, we can certainly contrast the two conflicts. We can look at war memory and look at legacy issues, but in Cambodia, I think they prefer to bury the legacy issues than to bring them into the open, as the pressure is on in Northern Ireland at the moment. So difficult to compare, easier to contrast, I think.
I agree with the nature of the other, but you could go back to a slightly early period and following the civil war in this country, there was an awful lot of internalizing and burying because we could only look inwards, unfortunately. But Kimsru, just on that, how the trauma of the conflict in the Khmer Rouge, how does that resonate today in Cambodia?
For like younger generation, it doesn't affect that much, but older generation, for example, my grandma, when we first moved to Phnom Penh and we live very close to the airport, so whenever she hears the airplane, she always reminds of the time when she has to escape. So she doesn't want to mention about the past, but when she tells a story, she tries to make it like fun. It's not like projecting the suffering that she has been through. And for a lot of Cambodia study about our history, very little. For me, to be honest, I learn more about my own history when I go abroad. So it's something that we all have to learn is about the past. And I also would like to say that something that we can learn from Ireland is the hope that we also can change. I know Ireland, like in the 1950s, I used to watch the film when I was in Ireland, and it's very similar to the Cambodia in the current situation. And Ireland has made it so far, even though Cambodia cannot make it fast, but we still has hope that we can make it someday.
Paul, just on that theme, the trauma of that kind of conflict, particularly an internal one, it does take decades to ultimately get over it.
Of course, and I think we had a similar experience with the famine and the coming to terms with that, the silence in the decades following it, indeed in the many decades following it, and the slow only coming to terms with it, even in the historiography. It strikes me that looking at the two countries, we have very long civilizational history and a very interesting comparative knowledge of Cambodia and Ireland, ancient and modern. And there's perhaps a lot can be learned in that kind of comparative civilizational history that we could, if we're emphasizing education, that those kind of values maybe could be brought to bear in a very interesting way, because looking at Southeast Asia from Europe, I'm struck by many interesting parallels between not only Ireland, but other European states and your part of the world, and the need to mitigate any period of big power conflict by preserving our own autonomy and our own capacity to make those friendships.
Indeed. And
Rick, sorry, can I come in there? Because this is just an amazing conversation. And in fact, I think we could go on and on.
But my mistake, Marty, I forgot.
No, it's just been fantastic. And there have been so many things brought forward. And as I say, we could listen and bring in new themes and everything. But I think it has given us a wonderful backdrop for, what we want to do. And that is to raise awareness and to forge friendships and connections, to also see what we have in common with Cambodia and Cambodia with us, and that we can learn from each other so very, very much. So I feel bad to kind of interject and stop, because I could see it and listen forever. But thank you so very, very much to yourself and to the panelists for such a stimulating discussion. Really, it was fantastic. We are going to move in more detail to look at the area of quality education and the immeasurable impact good teaching and learning can have on people's lives and their future and a country's development and prosperity as a whole. And as has been mentioned already, Cambodia Ireland Changemaker Network has called upon the Irish government to choose Cambodia as the main focus of Irish development aid in the Asian Mekong region from 2022. So our second video summarizes very clearly why we should choose Cambodia.
Over the next few years, Ireland will decide on the shape of its multi-annual strategy in the Mekong sub-region. We ask for your support of our goal. We ask Ireland to choose Cambodia as the main focus of support from 2022 onwards. Cambodia stands at a crossroads. It has faced political upheavals, struggles, complexity and changes, losing 2 million of its people under the brutal Khmer Rouge regime in the 1970s. Education was a key target of the regime. That trauma resonates to this day as a unique and tragic legacy that stands as barrier to fulfilling the human development potential of its people and the prosperity that should accompany it. Cambodia is among the furthest behind globally in terms of human development. Cambodia comes in behind the neighbouring countries of Laos, Philippines, Thailand and Vietnam. Poverty and inequalities persist despite progress. Cambodia's vision is to transform itself to an upper middle income country by 2030 and a developed country by 2050. The government identifies quality human capital as a main driving force towards that goal. Yet, Cambodia's human capital indicators lag well behind other lower middle income countries. Ireland's experience of trauma, conflict and post-conflict resonates with Cambodia's experiences, as does our identification of education and human capital as a main driver towards our economic and social development. A Better World states that people are what Irish development cooperation is all about. Our goal is that Ireland chooses Cambodia as the main focus of support in the Mekong sub-region from 2022, with education as a core intervention area. The Cambodian education system remains among the weakest in the world. The learning crisis is a significant drag on both the social and economic future of Cambodia. To achieve transformation in education outcomes, action is needed both to improve the frontline teaching and learning and to build the core research and institutional capacity needed for continuous improvement. A new partnership model where funding is conditional on progress and not on timetables, where changes are measured from the data and not opinion, where the focus is on sustainability and not on quick-fix solutions, and where leadership is inspired from within the country, offers great potential. There is an opportunity to empower women as education leaders within Cambodian education. This is in line with Irish Aid's own efforts to advance the gender equality agenda. Promotion of gender equality can be a key driver of Cambodian education reform. Ireland is committed to reaching the furthest behind first. Few countries demonstrate such a scale of educational need as Cambodia. We ask Ireland to choose Cambodia.
Thank you, Hala, for putting that on. We're going to move to our second panel. They're all living and working in Cambodia and each bringing a varied education experience to the table. Our moderator for this session is Maeve Corish. Hi, Maeve. And Maeve has stepped in at short notice following the news that our advertised moderator, Byrne, was ill. We wish Catherine a speedy recovery and thank Maeve for obliging at such short notice. Maeve has worked tirelessly through her role as a school principal and now in her retirement to forge links between Cambodia and Ireland. And she's the chairperson of SeeBeyondBorders Ireland. Over to you, Maeve, and your panel.
Thanks for the introduction, Mary. And before I start speaking to the three panelists, who I think will prove to be very interesting, can I just say a huge big well done to everybody involved in the production of the Choose Cambodia video. Each time I see it, I I'm impressed. I think it packs a powerful punch with its very simple message, not just highlighting the learning crisis in Cambodia, but emphasizing the potential we have here in Ireland to do something about it. And by working, I think, most importantly, in partnership with the Ministry of Education in Cambodia and with educators in Cambodia. So just a well done on everybody involved in the video. So it's my pleasure to introduce three panelists, three young people who are working in Cambodia. Two of them are Irish and one is Khmer. So we have Shauna O'Mahony, Colm Byrne, and Seng Kim Hong. And I'm going to start by talking to Hong. I've had the pleasure of meeting Hong in person a number of times. He runs an English language or a Khmer language school in Siem Reap. And I've had the pleasure of attending the school for lessons, both in person and then when the pandemic hit, online. And not only is Hong an exceptionally talented teacher, he's a great businessman and entrepreneur. But what strikes me when I've met Hong is his passion, and his passion for his work and the value of that work, because it is really, really important work he's doing. But probably more importantly and more impressively, his passion for his country and for the Cambodian people. So I'd like to ask Hong, first of all, to introduce himself and maybe tell us a little bit about his educational journey.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Hong. I am a director of Khmer Language School based in Siem Reap. Thank you so much, Maeve. Basically, I originally from Puttnam, but somehow I moved to Siem Reap since 2016. So during the 1990, when I was in primary school, basically I was in a fear, like insecure kid, because in my classroom, the teacher you stick, give them the wrong. I was fearful in the classroom, and it was terrible experience. And later on in 2020, when I goes to high school, so in the class, you just copy the teacher, what the teacher wrote on the board, pages to pages without explanation. And if you would get the explanation from the teacher, you have to take extra classes. So which means you have to pay those to the teacher so that the teacher can explain you more. And to me, I'm ready to give up in high school, but somehow, luckily, my older sister got a job as the English teacher. This is how she can support my study and support the family. So in deep down in my heart, I know that she would go further at university, but she couldn't. She gave up her dream and give it to me. So I vow myself that I have to graduate university for fulfill my sister's dream. So I graduate my bachelor degree in 2014 of the English literature. And I'm very proud what she did to me, and I can do this so far. And then somehow when I graduate university, I become a Khmer tutor full time. And in that time, not many foreigners in Cambodia. So for me, I would look for a greater opportunity. So I see in Siem Reap province, it's a tourist place that many foreigners living there, and they need lots of help, especially learning the language and the culture. So I decided to move to Siem Reap 2016, and then I start my school 2017. So far our school has been 4 years already, and I'm so proud of our teacher, and I'm so happy to be with my student journey in Cambodia.
Thanks, Hong. And I've spoken to so many Cambodians who would echo what you've said about maybe being in fear in their classrooms when they were younger. And also, I think a very common experience for many young Cambodians is having to pay extra to get the tuition that they need, that should be a basic, if you like. Just before my next question, or moving on to talking about COVID, the work you're doing in teaching Westerners Khmer, that's such important work. Can you talk to us a little bit about why that is so important to you, that when people come to visit your country, that they learn the language?
I think for me, language is to kind of open door, you know, to get to know someone. And also it's how people build relationship to each other. I will not understand you. I will not be your friend. I cannot get into your world without the language. So the language is kind of the key. That's why for me, the language is very important to have foreigner to understand us. Maybe some foreigner, they do not understand the culture. Sometimes they move to Cambodia, they have no idea what's going on. Sometimes they're frustrated, they don't know what to do. But because of the language, it's calm them. And also about the culture, you know, they kind of understand us better. So they can know why we behave this way and what is the reason. So that's why for me, it's very, very important to teach the foreigner about my language and my culture.
Absolutely, and there's a basic respect to it too, isn't there? You know, a reciprocal respect between the people of different nations in learning the language, or trying to learn the language, as it is for some of us. Can you talk to us a little bit about? So there you are. You've been building up this successful business, employing lots of young Cambodians. And you're rightly proud of their work. And then COVID-19 hits. Can you talk to us a little bit about the impact COVID-19 had on your business and on other businesses in Cambodia?
Yes, COVID is to have a very big also at the business, and I would say thank God that I can still survive to this day. I remember last year in February, more than half of my students, they started to chat to my school and told all the teachers we need to leave this country, to go back to our country because of COVID. And then I'm like, boom, what should I gonna do? Because like more than 50% of my students, they stop. So I have to say some goodbyes to my teacher as well. But because some of our students, they still can study online, and they would like to support us because they feel like what we are doing is the right things to do. So they keep studying with us online. But other business like hotel, restaurants, souvenir places, the craft people that they build something by hands, they have to close all of that because those businesses in Siem Reap based on tourism. And without tourists, they cannot earn. So thousands of people lose the job, and not just the people that lose unemployed, and also the next generation that they start university have to give up school because they cannot earn, they cannot afford for their school fee. So this is very, very sad.
Yeah, it had a devastating impact, and probably more to the people in the cities than those in the rural community. So those of you working and living in Siem Reap or the cities were really majorly impacted by it. Can I ask you to think back to education again? What would you identify as the main challenges for young Cambodians who want to access education? What are the main challenges? Can you identify a couple of them?
Yes, I think I would say two main points. The first is about, leaving your family, because in my culture, leaving your families is your comfort zone. You have to respect the family. You look after them when they are old. This is the gratitude that we should show to our parents. But because in the rural area or some villages, there is no school, there is no good high school, there is no university. So they have to force themselves to leave the family, to leave the one they love, they have to take care of. To be alone and just focus on your study is very hard for them already, to miss their family, and it's just hard already. And the second point, I think, is about finance, because as you can see, they have to find job to support themselves to study. So because of the COVID and no job, unemployed, so I heard many young people, my staff friends or the young people that I meet at the restaurant or on the way, when I ask them about their education, they say, sorry brother, I quit because I have money to support my study. So I think finance also a big problem in Cambodia.
Yeah, and more so now with the pandemic.
Yes, yes, sure.
One last question for you at this moment, Hong, although I'll probably return to you in a while if we get a chance. But, I mentioned your passion, and it's something that anybody who ever meets you will say, you're so passionate about wanting positive change for Cambodia. So if I was to ask you to articulate, what's your dream for your country? I know that's a big question, but if you were to pick, you know, what would you like to see happen in Cambodia?
Wow, it's a big question. Thank you, Maeve. I think my big dream is to see the education, you know, can access everywhere in my country. It doesn't matter, like rural areas, city, village, they can access the education, they can study, and all the next generation, they can learn not just with the, you know, fearful environment like me. I want them to learn with the freedom environment, with the fun environment, you know, with the teacher. So this is what I hope, and I do believe that the education is the key to see the new world.
Thanks a million, Hong. Thanks a million.
Yes.
Shauna, I'm going to move to you next, if that's okay. You might introduce yourself, and you've done so many interesting things, but you might introduce yourself and let people know how long you're in Cambodia and something about the work that you do there.
Right. So my name is Shauna. I'm originally from Limerick, and I've been in Cambodia since 2015. Initially, I worked as a teacher in international schools in Phnom Penh for a couple of years while I was studying my PGCEI with the University of Nottingham. By the time I finished studying education and working in the international schools here, I got a little bit disenfranchised. And I also saw just really amazing opportunities in the arts. So I moved into visual arts, and particularly arts related to female empowerment. So I had previously a street art gallery. After that, for the female empowerment, we put on the first ever Cambodian production of the Vagina Monologues, which is a feminist play by Eve Ensler from 1993. And we actually had it performed in Khmer. Recently, I still work as an education consultant. I just hosted the Cambodia Climate Change Summit last month, which quite interested me when Lord David mentioned that, because he's right, it's a problem. But yeah, really, so just with more context within everything, I'm actually a student at Hong School. I have an exam in the morning, and and I feel very happy to be here today. That I'm here by chance, where this time last year I met Kimsru at a dinner party, and I was bragging that I had started learning to read and write Khmer, and lo and behold, she started speaking Irish to me. And as you can imagine, I was completely shocked, and I was like, well, where did you learn how to do that? And she told me all about Pepe and SeeBeyondBorders, and yeah, months later, here we are, and I'm very happy to be here today. So thank you for having me.
And we're very happy to have you here too, Shauna. Can I ask you, you had your experience working in international schools, but in general, can I ask you, would you see that there's a learning crisis in Cambodia? And, you know, what are your thoughts around that?
I would say definitely, and I would say that you know, it's interesting what everyone said earlier, that Cambodia is 70% of the country is rural, and I don't have that experience. I don't have that insight. I've been in Phnom Penh for 6 years nonstop, so I can only kind of comment on what I've seen here. But in Phnom Penh alone, we have 500 international schools, and less than 20 of them hold any sort of accreditation that holds any weight anywhere else. So there's a big gap that's occurring between the local education and particularly the lower end, I'm going to say, international schools that Cambodian parents are sending their kids to, because they think, because of the advertising, which can be misleading, or maybe because they don't understand what a quality education looks like, because they didn't have the benefit of having one themselves. So they don't have the criticality about the schools they're sending their kids to as well. So there's a lot of parents that think they're doing what's best for their child, but in reality, we know that they're going to a very poor school by international standards. One of the other issues I would say is with upward mobility. So third level education is quite poor here, and it's very hard to become very professionalized in an area. At the moment, only 5% of Cambodian students are graduating from STEM subjects, when apparently by 2030, 30% of the labor force and the jobs will be in that area. So that's not great. But I would say, on an anecdotal level, from my personal experience, one of the biggest issues is educating the older generation to understand what's best for the younger generation. So an example I would use for that is I think that students should be moving into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. But a lot of older Cambodian parents will want their daughters in particular to study accounting. They think accounting is a good, safe job. They're familiar with it. They know there's a lot of roles right now, but we know that accounting is going to be automated in the next 10 years, the majority of roles, and that isn't where we should be putting the efforts in. So one of the crises as well, I think, is having that the transparency of what quality education is, and the human capital, what is that Cambodia needs, what does that look like, and what educational steps need to be made, because it doesn't seem like there's an action plan towards that at the moment.
Thanks, Shauna. And I was fascinated when I first started reading about your work in the arts, putting on the vagina monologues in Khmer is quite radical. But can you talk to us a little bit more about how the arts can play a role in empowering people, and particularly empowering young women in Cambodia?
Well, I would say, and it seems obvious, but I actually didn't believe it till I tried it myself. So I joined the Vagina Monologues in 2018 as an actress. I was forced into it by a friend who insisted I'd have a good time. I did not believe her. And there's something I'd never seen before, but the power of having a group of women together for a single purpose in a room was incredible. We had 36 women from 20 different countries, Cambodian all across the world, and it was the first time I ever really understood girl power and what that meant, and what you can see what happens when women come together. So the following year I heard that the production wasn't going to be put on, and I was devastated, and I felt like this has to happen. We need this to happen for the women in the city, for everything. And in the end I decided to put it on myself if it wasn't going to happen through anyone else. We went further and we turned it into a female empowerment festival. So we took like some of the top psychologists, female psychologists, the top scientists, the top women in business, women in sports, dancers, rappers, break dancers, visual artists, street artists, and we created this big one-day event. And what I really found from it was like the local girls were just so inspired. And it's not really like there's a misconception about Cambodian women that they're shy. They're not shy. They just need a platform. They need to be given a platform to say what they want. And once you provide that platform, they're absolutely unstoppable. So I'm really proud to have been able to provide that platform previously before. And my real goal here is to keep doing projects like this, but to step away from them myself so that it's a Cambodian platform run by Cambodian women for Cambodian women. And I've just seeded it in its early stages. But yeah, that would, I think, and like one more thing I'd like to add as well, like when we talk about giving women a platform and you see them excel, you see it here. We have a Gaelic football team in Phnom Penh, and it's mostly Cambodian girls, totally shy off the pitch. And then the second you see them get on, the second you give them that venue, they're completely different people. And I think it's the same in the arts. Once you provide the arena, the venue, the people will come, you know.
Thanks, Shauna, and I couldn't agree with you more. I have certainly not found Cambodian women to be shy. I know a number of powerhouses, and I think what you were saying there really resonates with what Kimsru was saying earlier about how, women are becoming more empowered in Cambodia, which is a great thing. When Kimsru mentioned how, when she was young, that every decision that was made had to be run past a man or that, and that's changing. So I think what you're doing in the arts is so important in that Cambodian women are standing up more for themselves, and I think anything that can help develop that is wonderful. So thanks for that. I look forward to watching what happens next in this space, Shauna. I'm going to move to our final panelist, Colm Byrne. So Colm is one of the people who is hugely inspirational behind the Cambodia Ireland Changemaker Network. Colm and I taught together for a number of years. He was working in the school where I worked as principal teacher, and he ran away from Cambodia. So he's a proud Irishman, or He will often say he's from County Fingal, but he very much refers to Cambodia now as home. Can I hand over to you, Colm, to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work in SeeBeyondBorders?
Sure, Maeve. Well, the first thing is you introduced this panel as being 3 young people. So I'm delighted to hear that as a 39-year-old, I'm classified as young. I think my partner might quibble with you, and my mum certainly would, looking at my grey hairs. You'll
always be a young fella to me.
Yeah. No, honestly, it's fantastic to be here. And while historically I obviously played a part in Cambodia Ireland Network, you know, my involvement in this webinar was basically non-existent, and it's massively wonderful to see. I've never seen so many people at a Zoom call. Maybe I need to get out more. So yeah, by background, I'm a teacher by background. Taught in Dunabay for 10 years, and I moved to Cambodia 7.5 years ago, and immediately kind of had an affinity with the place, to be honest with you. And that affinity was with the people, and one need only listen to Hong or Kimsru to see the connection that can be made even on Zoom. So decided to make Cambodia my home, and for the last 4 years I've had the honor to work with for a charity called SeeBeyondBorders, because Cambodia is a huge amount of charities, a huge amount of NGOs. The problem isn't quantity, the problem is looking for the quality charities. And I was lucky to meet a couple called Ed and Kate, who were really trying to do something a little bit different in development. So that's where I am today, the CEO of SeeBeyondBorders Ireland, and combined that with Director of Development for the international organization.
And what's different really about SeeBeyondBorders, and if we, go back to what Shauna was saying about international schools, SeeBeyondBorders is working within the public school system in Cambodia, and I think that's really, really important. Looking to achieve systemic change through the public system rather than through private schools. Can I ask you to identify, what would you see as the critical educational challenges in the Cambodian education system?
Yeah, good question. So I'd first focus on the positive, because I'm sometimes a glass half full person, but I would say the positive is that enrollment rates have improved dramatically. So enrollment rates for early years are near full, or were prior to COVID, which is fantastic. Second thing is there's been a lot of infrastructural work and infrastructural school buildings being developed, which is fantastic. But access to a school isn't necessarily access to an education. It might be on the island of Ireland, but it's not here in Cambodia, because all the evidence would tell us that in order to get access to an education, the child needs to be taught effectively, and there needs to be a positive learning environment. We don't trail, somebody said earlier, we train, years behind Vietnam. We don't. The reality is we trail decades behind. Less than 3% of Cambodian children reach the very, very minimum learning standards internationally. Part of that is due to the history with 90% of teachers killed, but another part is present day challenges. And one final challenge as well, if I may say, is there's an increasing inequality within Cambodia, as well as between Cambodia and other countries, with the difference between the north of Cambodia, areas like Siem Reap and Puttnam, compared with areas in the south. So real profound challenges. But what's the one challenge? What does it all come down to, Maeve? Quality. The quality of education is the biggest challenge.
Which leads me to my next question about the role of the teacher. Can you talk to us a little bit about why the role of the teacher is critical for successful learning?
Yeah, well, look, I'm sure there's a huge number of people on this call, and we'll all remember inspirational teachers and the role a teacher can make in changing a child's life. I remember I had a teacher called Bill Lowe, or principal, and he was absolutely amazing. And what he drilled into us was this isn't my school. It's not your school, Colm, it's our school, and the collective shared ownership. And I think we have a little bit of that in SeeBeyondBorders, to be honest with you, in terms of a collective ownership of what we're trying to do. And teachers' access to good quality teaching is at the heart of solution in Cambodia. There's been a lot of aid money spent here on teacher manuals, a lot of aid spent on school buildings, but aid at the correct dose and aid targeted at improving quality teaching, and I think this is where Irish Aid come in, can make a transformative difference. You know, one statistic I'll give you, Maeve, is there's independent testing carried out in our programs, and not our testing, we don't correct it. But as a result of children being in our programs, their test scores improved by 35% points. It was 45 and then COVID happened, but 35 percentage points. And why is that? Because we work day in, day out with teachers, not we as in Barangs or Khmer staff, day in, day out on a mentoring basis. And because that child can learn, they're therefore much more likely to stay in school. But it all, if you go back and you tread it back, it's all by empowering and supporting teachers.
Yeah, the most important resource in any school is the teacher, not the building or the physical resources. Going back to the other panelists, maybe Shauna or Hong might like to come in here. We've only got a couple of minutes, but just if you were to choose one priority to improve education for Cambodian children, what would you choose? Would either of you like to come in on that? What would you choose if you were to pick one priority for improving? Like Colm has very much said, you know, upskill the teacher, there's a priority. Hong, would you have a priority there?
Yeah, I think so. I think as I mentioned, you know, when I was in primary school in 1990, I think the teacher is a very important, it's a priority. You know, if the teacher can teach the student with the fun environment, with the positive environment, the student can learn. Like me, I was at the bottom in the class, to be honest, because I feel for when I have question, I would ask, but I couldn't dare because I'm afraid of the stick, you know, and this is stopped me. That's why I'm ready to give up in high school. But look back, if in my environment study in a primary school would be positive and give me freedom, and the teacher would, you know, care for me a little bit, I think I would happy to continue my study. So yeah, I totally agree. The teacher is priority. It's very important.
and you're so right. The relationship, you know, teaching is a relationship, and
Sure.
you know, having a positive environment, having a bit of fun, and feeling secure rather than fearful. Yeah, Shauna, do you have any comments there on what would your priority be?
I think it could be very important, and I honestly, I don't know if it's possible, but if there was some sort of unification of the private and public school agendas, in that, you know, it's patchwork happening around the country, and we are all working towards a goal, but there's not much unity to it. That's more of a pipe dream than a reality, I think. Yeah. So.
And I've never seen the statistics. I don't know if any of you know them, but like, what are the statistics of private schools there in the primary school system? Does anybody know how many? There just seem to be so many private schools.
There's only about 5, Maeve, that would properly allow a Cambodian student go to an international university based on what they studied in high school, without having to do something interim to reach a certain standard. There'd only be about 5, I'd say, and even of those 5, they might be limited to the kind of home countries they're connected to. It mightn't even stand across the board internationally. And of the top 3 of those, they can cost over $30,000 a year. So not viable for Cambodians.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna finish up. Last word to you, Colm.
Yeah. But just to put this in context as well, there's 1.5 million Cambodians today have daily income of less than 92 cents a day. So let that resonate. And there's huge challenges here, but also there's huge opportunities. We talked a little bit about similarities between Cambodia and Ireland, and obviously in many ways it's worlds apart. But both have a troubled recent history. Both are blighted by emigration. Both have a troubled relationship with our nearest neighbour. But there's a real opportunity for Ireland. And I don't just mean Irish Aid, but Irish citizens to get involved and get active. Because I'd urge everybody on this call, don't think that you can't play a role, because people can. And when aid is given in the right dose So not tens of millions of aid, but done right, it makes a profound difference to charities, but much more importantly, it makes profound difference to the lives of Cambodians, the Hongs of the world, the Kimsrus of the world. You know, that's the testament to what can work, what does work. So I'd hope that, you know, everybody who was on this call would recognize that. But it's been great.
Thanks, Colm. Thanks, Shauna. Thanks, Hong. And I'm passing back to Mary, passing the baton back to you, Mary.
Thanks so much, Maeve. And again, to your panelists there, you know, being part of this conversation has brought in so many, I suppose, reflections, even over the last hour and a half. And when Hong was mentioning there about, you know, being a child in school and the effect maybe, you know, of negative teaching, you could call it teaching happened to him. I was involved in teaching all my life and yet had started out also with very negative experiences of fear and worry and that in primary school. But I can say, if I look over my teaching career, that what helped me to evolve and continues to help me to evolve, even in retirement, is continual professional development, learning, being open to new ideas. But I think that's what really helped Irish education to move forward, because I saw it move forward right from, you know, chalk and talk to an amazing education system now. But it was actually, you know, it was an investment in teachers, not just an investment in schools, but actually an investment in professional development. There's been some very interesting chats and discussions in the chat room and so on. Some of the things have been covered already. I think people have been really enjoying things. But just to summarize, Makra says, it's really touching my heart. Kimsru says, my dream to see students have access to quality education and that they can pursue their dreams. Cecil has mentioned the importance of soft skills and communication skills and so on, you know, which we're all learning, but at the same time, it's so very, very important for a developing country like Cambodia. And Catherine has mentioned that she's really inspired by the webinar, and there was just one other there, super informative, interesting. But I'd also like to mention there was something there from oh yes, John Friend Pereira says teachers are the profession upon which all other professions depend. Good quality, confident teachers using constructive pedagogy are virtual. They're absolutely vital. So to finish off today's event, from myself and the committee that put it together, I'd like to say just a million thanks to everybody who's been part of it. But I'd also like to call on our chairperson of our network, the Cambodia Ireland Changemaker Network, Cecilia Gavigan, to say the last few words and sum up on our behalf. Cecilia.
Thanks so much, Mary. And if it hasn't already, as I'm speaking, a little poll might pop up on your screen, so feel free to just fill that in as we go. I think Mary and Colm have given us some really great closing remarks already, but I suppose I'd like to officially say thank you and akun to all of our panelists, because I think it's just been such an inspiring conversation. It really is one of those that could have gone on for 3 or 4 hours. Like you could take one of these people in a room and happily engage in conversation for eons. I just think they've just been so generous in sharing their insight and their time. So really a huge thank you to all the panelists. As Mary mentioned, a big thank you to the team from the network who organized the event. Special thank you to Hala, who is doing our behind the scenes logistics and day. Thank you to Rua, who's my baby in the background, being kind of quiet, but not quite quiet enough. I thank you to the people, our video whiz kids, so Rorth for the first video and to Megan for our second video. They were really, I think just they add another dimension to things. And then lastly, a huge thank you to all the attendees, because where would we be if you weren't here? Just thank you for showing your interest in Cambodia. Thanks for building the partnerships that exist already between the two countries. And like, while we're on completely different sides of the globe, I think Colm touched on the heart of why there can be this really close, deep connection. I think there is such similarities. Maybe I know Des was saying earlier, like differences in the conflict, but at the same time, post-conflict societies and that focus on peace building and moving past things, the agrarian aspect to things. But I think there's just something from the Cambodians that I know, there's just that sense of fun, and the importance of family and that kind of relationships are really important. And I think that's something that can forge a really strong connection between the two countries going forward. And hopefully we will be able to build those stronger partnerships like Lord Puttnam mentioned might be necessary in the future. The only thing is I don't know which way we might be going, because there's definitely parts of Ireland that are very vulnerable to the climate crisis as well. But I think a really strong relationship between the two countries was something that is to be aspired towards. I think it would be a positive for all of us. And I'm never one to leave a talk is fabulous, but I always have that quote from Margaret Mead in my head, which is that one that's never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So I would call all of you, everyone who's been on the call today, to action. Like, we all have our spheres of influence. Like, they might seem not important to you. You might think, oh, I have no power whatsoever, but there's always somebody that you can share with. There's somebody that you can convince, somebody that you can discuss these things with. So I would ask you all to please, when we finish the Zoom, you should be redirected to our membership sign up. So please do join the network. It's a really fulfilling group of people, really interested in change, like really creative. We will have the recording of the event available afterwards. It'll be most likely sent to you through the same Zoom communications that you would have gotten the link from. Share it with people, maybe somebody who you think might be interested in it, or even people who you maybe may not be interested in it, but you think this is actually really relevant to what you do. So we'd ask you to spread the word, and then just go and advocate for Cambodia, advocate for development education as a vital part of children's education, advocate for children to learn about the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think this is crucial to me, and I think it's a part of why our network is special, in my opinion. Advocate for that philosophy of solidarity and partnership, that we're no longer in the, like, while there have been great work done in the past by missionaries and charities, that's not where we are any longer. We are global citizens. We are in partnership together. So it's with that sense of shared understanding, a shared world, that we build this partnership and we help those who need to be helped, and we learn from each other in a, I suppose, a really positive philosophical way. Right, so yeah, that's my tuppence. So thanks very much, Mary. I'll throw it back to you if you want to say a quick goodbye before we go.
Well, just to say goodbye to everybody who's just come from so many different places. Thank you for the amazing contributions in the chat room. There's been so much going on, and I think thanks Cecilia for an inspirational ending. Yes, it's definitely something that we need to take forward and take forward together. I'd like to also thank very, very much the team who helped over the months to put this together. And of course, Hala, who put it together for today as well, just in these last hour and a half. Wishing you all the very, very best to stay well and stay active and stay inspired. Thank you very much indeed. A little poll has come up. If you would like to just fill it in before we say goodbye, it would help us a lot. This was our very first webinar, and you know, you never know, we might be able to take things forward into a future one. So if you have a chance just to click a button there on how you felt about it. In the meantime, please stay well and stay involved. Thank you very much indeed.